Hello again, and we're going to continue our study of sonnets now with another very famous poet from the Renaissance/Restoration period, John Donne. And he was famous for his holy sonnets. This one is called Death Be Not Proud. Now remember again, the title comes from the first line of the poem. They really were actually numbered, Holy Sonnet 1, Holy Sonnet 2, etc. This one is a certain number, but it's easier to remember it by its first line, Death Be Not Proud. So a little bit about John Donne. He lived from 1572 to 1631, so bridging the Renaissance to the Restoration era. His name was John Donne, pronounced Dunn, and he's known as a metaphysical poet. Interestingly about his name, he actually wrote a poem kind of making a play on his name, and it ends off with, "And so now I am done," playing on his name, Donne, right? Now, a metaphysical poet means he wrote about love and spirituality in a deep way, using something called the metaphysical conceit. A metaphysical conceit is an elaborate or unusual comparison, especially one using unlikely metaphors, simile, hyperbole, or contradictions. So we're going to really look at that when we look at his poems. Now, Donne himself was a paradox. As a young man, like many Renaissance men, he was rather wild. His earliest poetry is extremely risque. We're going to look at the flea later on. And believe me, when I say risque, I mean very risque. When I was a young student, I blush a lot anyway, but I was really, really blushing when I read his poetry because I'm like, wow, this guy is really out there. However, later on he married a woman he loved very much, and he was very faithful to her the rest of his life. And then he took partial orders and wrote the Holy Sonnets. So his life had a complete turnaround. And one of the best examples of his work, though, was not a sonnet, and it's something I greatly recommend that you read, is Valediction Forbidding Mourning, written about his great love and faithfulness to his wife. So it's interesting, if you ever have a chance to really study his poems more closely, his early period when he was young, he often uses spiritual comparisons to highlight sexual content. And later on in his holy sonnets, he actually used sexual comparisons to highlight holy concepts. So it's pretty interesting. One of the ones that I recommend if you want to look at that more closely is Batter My Heart, Three-Person God, where he says, "I will never be pure unless God completely ravishes me, like my lover." So it's pretty amazing what he does. So this one is Death Be Not Proud. And it says, "Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, but thou art not so. For those whom thou think'st thou dost overthrow, die not, poor Death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppier charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die." It's a pretty powerful poem. First of all, we look at the word death there. He's addressing death as if it's actually there and he can actually talk to it. So it's the act of addressing some abstraction or personification that is not physically there. That's an apostrophe. It's different than the punctuation mark. An apostrophe is the act of addressing some abstraction or personification that is not physically present. So he's talking to death as if it was a person. Now, to really understand what he's doing in the first part, we look at some of the common depictions of death. So we see him as a grim reaper, right? That's very famous. Very powerful, very scary, bent on carrying people to the underworld. Okay? Another important depiction of death is the dance of the dead. This idea is that death will dance with anyone, whether they're noble or poor, clergyman or commoner, whatever you are, you're one day going to have to do the dance with death, and he will take you away to his kingdom. Danse macabre. Okay. Another common depiction of death is the idea of the triumph of death. So here we see this whole place wiped out by death's presence. So the triumph of death. So all of these are portraying death as very powerful and unconquerable. So he's really, again, just like Shakespeare combats the idea of the blazon, he's coming up against the common concepts of death. It says, "Death, be not proud." So here we have, again, we can tell it's an Italian sonnet because it's in two sections in an octave and a sestet. It's an iambic pentameter, 14 lines, two sections, an octave and a sestet, and the volta, which is the turn, it usually occurs right before the sestet. So let's revisit iambic pentameter. An iamb is a type of foot unit of poetic accent that has one offbeat followed by a strong accent. Da-dum. So a pentameter has 5 of these da-dums in a line. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. 10 syllables, 5 feet. Like that. And we usually break them up with those little slash marks in between them. Okay? There are different ways that we have different types of feet. We could have a da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, dum-dum, da-dum-da. So there's different ways to do it, but this is I am, and I am has the da-dum. Okay? Now let's look at this as an example. Die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. That's an iambic pentameter. Again, 5 feet in with syllables da-dum. Okay? Now we look at the first 8 lines, and they present the problem, argument, or quandary. And the last 6 lines, that's the sestet, that's the last 6 lines presents a resolution, answer, or solution. Okay, so it's an Italian sonnet. Now the volta usually occurs at the beginning of the sestet. So we see a change, a shift in the tone. The sonnet shifts from depicting the stereotype of death as powerful, also pointing out how really miserable and small death really is. So it's really amazing. The volta, again, is the turn. So let's look at some other interesting things that Donne is doing with this poem. He uses something called enjambment. Enjambment makes a poem sound a lot more natural. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful. So you see that? What he's doing is he's flowing from the word thee to the second line, mighty and dreadful, without stopping. There's no pause there. It's very natural. You know, instead of the very choppy roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, so are you, he flows from one line to the next, just like we're talking. It's more natural. So it makes it sound less poemish. Another thing he does that's really interesting is he uses caesura, and that's when you actually pause in the middle of the line. So instead of stopping at the end of the line, you pause in the middle. So from rest and sleep, which must thy pictures be, much pleasure. Pause. Then from thee much more must flow. Right there. He uses it in another place, and better than thy stroke. Pause. Why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Pause. Death, thou shalt die. So you see he uses caesura in a couple of places there. Let's go over this poem. First of all, death is depicted as a conqueror, and the rest of the sonnet combats the stereotype. I really love these poems where they're really coming up against these long-held stereotypes. He compares death to sleep, and he says that martyrs and brave men are not afraid of death. You're so powerful, but look, there's these other people here, and they go to you willingly. And yet, death is really a slave, and he keeps bad company, just a poor imitator of drugs. Finally, Donne brings in the Christian belief of eternal life. If after death life is eternal, then there will be a time when there's no more death. Therefore, death itself shall be dead. I just love that last line, death, thou shalt die. Just amazing line. I really hope you enjoyed this poem and our short venture into Donne. We're going to also look at The Flea, which is a poem from his earlier stage of life. I think you'll find that interesting.